Excellencies, dear colleagues, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to who is with us on WebEx and to who is now or later watching this video. We have the pleasure to welcome you today for a new session of our Geneva BIT Plastic Pollution Dialogues, which have kept the international community in Geneva and beyond engaged on the topic, in the past months, making links with the United Nations Environment Assembly and other international processes. The Geneva BIT Plastic Pollution Dialogues are organized by the Geneva Environment Network in collaboration with the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Convention Secretariat, the Center for International Environmental Law, the Global Governance Center at the Graduate Institute, IUCN, Norway, Switzerland, and the Forum on Trade, Environment, and Sustainable Development Goals. Today, we are discussing financial cooperation and technical assistance in a new plastic agreement. 4 of the leading experts we have with us have engaged throughout our journey, including the representative of Ecuador, hardly engaged in the ministerial conference on plastics that took place in Geneva in September last year, that led to the draft resolution by Peru and Rwanda on an internationally legally binding instrument on plastic pollution. Before we go into depth on the topic we are addressing today, let me remind you that the documents presented, the summary, as well as the video of the event will be made available on the webpage of this event. The link has been shared in the chat. Throughout the event, you can raise your questions by using the Q&A box. The moderator will use your questions to feed the discussion after the presentations. Today, your guide and moderator is David Azoulay, leading the Geneva office of the Center for International Environmental Law, or CIEL, and also director of its environmental health program. David will be setting the scene and introducing the speakers as they speak, including Ecuador, for its opening remarks. David, over to you.
Thank you very much, Diana, and welcome everyone to this hopefully very interesting webinar. I'm not going to go into too much details in terms of context because my assumption is that most of you already know a lot of what is going on. But just to remember, just to remind everyone, the global community's attention on the plastic problem has been rising along the past decade, more or less, and along the past 5 or 6 years, there's been some intense and in-depth conversation happening in the context of the United Nations Environment Assembly. As the discussions progressed, it became more and more clear that the existing global policy framework was too fragmented and was not sufficient to adequately address the issue of global plastic pollution. The global plastic pollution is a global issue that requires a global responses. And so as the idea of developing a dedicated instrument to address the question of plastic pollution advanced and moved forward, the conversation became more and more specific about the treaty, and we are now to the point where we have there has been over 120, I think, countries who have supported one way or the other the development for a global response to the plastic crisis. The instrument that is being proposed ranges from something legally, from something voluntary focused on marine pollution in particular, to something legally binding covering the whole life cycle of plastics. 2 resolutions have been put forward to the upcoming UNEP meeting that will take place in February. One has been put forward by Peru and Rwanda and is now co-sponsored by, I think, 42 countries at the last count, and is one that aims at suggesting or insisting on a broad framework that is legally binding that covers the entire life cycle of plastic. Another resolution has been put forward by the government of Japan. The last count, I don't think it had yet gathered or announced some co-sponsors, but it is being presented and is being discussed in the context of the CPR, the Committee of Permanent Representative to UNEP based in Nairobi. For those of you interested in comparing the 2 resolutions, Ciel and EIA have put forward have developed a table that compares the text of the two, that allows you to get a better understanding of what the different text proposes. Now that we're moving into this direction, and that it is expected that the upcoming UNEP meeting will adopt a mandate for a discussion, we are in a position to discuss in slightly more detail or more granular way what would this treaty look like and what would be required for this new instrument to be a success. And similarly to what we've been seeing under every instrument that has been adopted or that is currently being implemented in the international environmental arena, the question of funding and technical support is essential. We know, and we'll hear about this in the presentation later, that a lot of the existing instruments are facing challenges in meeting their funding requirements to ensure that all countries have the necessary funding and technical assistance to implement existing obligation that stems from the treaty. And of course, as we're moving and developing a new instrument, there are a lot of questions about how can country effectively dispose, or how can country effectively bring together both the technical expertise, the technical resources, and the financial resources that will allow them to effectively apply or implement the legal obligation that will stem from the new instrument. And this is, of course, a major and key element of the discussion, as no country in their right mind would want to subject themselves to new obligation without being sure that they can actually implement them and enforce whatever obligation they would be adopted. So joining us today to have this discussion, we have a very distinguished panel of experts who have looked into this particular questions and have also looked at the different ways of financing global instruments and how to mobilize finance around the question of reduction of plastic. And so with no further ado, it is now my honor to introduce Mr. Walter Schult, who is the Director of the Environment and Sustainable Development Department at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Human Mobility of the Government of Ecuador. Walter, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, David. I hope you can hear me well. First of all, I want to thank Geneva Environment World Network, BRS Secretariat, CL, IUCN, Norway, Switzerland, and the rest of organizers for the kind invitation to take part of this event, which, from my point of view, will be an additional important contribution to the long process of debate, exchange, and the lessons learning that it has provided to the international agenda and to the fight against plastic pollution since last year. It is also very encouraging to see that in spite of all the challenges of the economic downturn, the COVID-19 pandemic, the multiple crises, there is, I would assess that there is now a steady increase in the level of the political will among governments and other relevant stakeholders to address comprehensively the threat and impacts of marine litter and plastic pollution, and also the recognition that it has an impact not only in terms of environmental terms, but also and biodiversity, but also to health, economies, trade, tourism, sustainable development at large, and even human rights. Precisely as part of this, the different efforts to foster that political will, as you already mentioned, Ecuador, together with Germany, Ghana, and Vietnam, with the support of Norway and UNEP, we launched during the first part of the fifth session of UNEA 5 in February 2021, a process towards the first ministerial conference of marine litter and plastic pollution. That process had an overwhelming level of participation, more than 1,000 representatives from 140 countries, and a large number of international organizations, civil society, academia, and private sector. As a result also of that inclusive preparatory process and the conference itself, which took place in Geneva in September last year, an important group of criteria and elements of what should be or could be the future agreement were clearly identified, and I will mention very few, some of them. The scope of the agreement, the common objectives and goals, the concrete commitments to reduce and phase out plastic pollution through the entire life cycle of plastics, from design and production to consumption and waste management, The means of implementation, including the need to provide and mobilize robust financial and technical support, which is the subject of today's session, technology transfer and capacity building, all of that to ensure that all countries, including developing countries, and SEEDs and LDCs in particular, are able to implement the provisions of the agreement. Also, it was clearly identified the importance of science-based measure, comparable methodologies, and common standards for data gathering, baselines, and indicators. The need to ensure complementarity with existing mechanisms and initiatives, not to start from scratch, but really to promote and build upon the existing mechanisms to ensure collaboration with national and regional cooperation efforts. At the end of that process, a ministerial declaration was adopted with the purpose of building the momentum and political will to advance a coherent global strategy to address marine litter and plastic pollution, but most importantly, to deliver a clear message of wide support to the future establishment of an INC, an Intergovernmental Negotiation Committee at UNEP 5.2, to negotiate that global agreement, a one that is robust, legally binding, and with sufficient means of implementation. An additional deadline was provided to other countries for other countries to adhere after the end of the conference, and we reached therefore 75 countries supporting that declaration. Now, among the concrete elements and proposals that emerged in those discussions and on that process on financial cooperation and technical assistance, I can mention the need to include a financial mechanism to support developing countries, in particular SEEDs and LDCs, to fulfill the treaty obligations. Also, that support for the development and implementation of national action plans with incentives for promoting a circular economy. According to others, such financial and technical support could be provided where they achieve the greatest return for investment, including, for example, targeting upstream measures and preventive action to reduce generation of waste. Also fostering the consideration of material reduction and sustainable low carbon technologies, including by providing incentives for industries to use more recycled materials and for making plastics more recyclable. Other suggestions also mention the importance of exploring innovative financial mechanisms and attracting private sector investments, including by scaling up de-risking investment. Extended producers' responsibility schemes were also emphasized as potential tools to ensure funding from private sector, including the need to incorporate the polluter pays principle. Another tool that could be used for technology and resource was the matching mechanisms, as well as a possible dedicated scientific or technical body to gather economic and market knowledge, develop standards and guidelines for measuring progress, and establish inventories. Here, I would like to also invite to look at the example of the UNFCCC, where we have the TEC and the CTCN as bodies that provide also or have had some experience in matching the offer and the needs in terms of technology transfer and development, which could be used also as an example for future such mechanism for this treaty. A specific funding mechanism has also been suggested, including, for example, a global fund or a dedicated window in existing mechanisms such as the GEF or other funds. Here, I think we also should learn from previous experiences, including from GEF and the GCF, to avoid such delay process and years until we got a proper operation and a sort of efficient delivery of those funds. Finally, there were also suggestions that the establishment of the INC includes a mandate to coordinate and structure support for stable and predictable funding, directing attention to actors with significant plastic footprints and also vulnerable communities. There also were mentions to take into account the gender and the human rights approach. In this, also another specific aspects were mentioned at the beginning of the process that we had towards the ministerial conference in September was starting from the recognition that there are barriers for some countries in terms of access to funding and also for technology transfer and development. In the summary of the chair of the ad hoc expert group, for example, there was a clear mention to the existence of those barriers and to the need to encourage new and enhancing existing forms of financial and technical support. Among those barriers and limitations that several countries, including, for instance, subnational governments and other stakeholders, face to access multilateral funds, it has been mentioned that small participation of private funds and investors in the existing mechanisms is still there. There also was mentioned the limited attention from donors to some sectors with significant plastic footprints, the absence of a specific focus on gender, the lack of information and resources in multiple languages, the differences in technologies and standards between countries and regions, the lack of data comparability, the absence of significant specific case studies in certain regions, and the lack of indigenous peoples and local community-based initiatives. In some, we need to
Mr.
learn.
Schultz, I'm sorry. Yes, I'm going to ask you to conclude. Thank you very much.
Absolutely, thank you so much. I'm sorry. In some, just one sentence. We need to learn from lessons, as I mentioned, from UNFCCC, CBD, VRS, and other international agreements to really save time, avoid repeating the mistakes, and learn from the good experiences also that we have and lessons learned from those examples to really enhance. So I'm looking forward to hear the rest of the panelists, and thank you again for the invitation.
Thank you very much, Walter. And I think this was a perfect overview and introduction to the discussion, reminding us not to multiply and duplicate the work, learn from what has been done before, and also not be afraid of being a little innovative and inventive to address this particular challenge. So I think that was a perfect scene setting. Thank you very much. We'll now hear from a number of experts giving us their views and some more ideas and food for thought for us to come up with an adequate solution. Our first speaker on the panel today will be Tim Grabiel, a senior lawyer with the Environmental Investigation Agency. Tim, the floor is yours.
Thank you, David. Hello, my name is Tim Grabiel. As mentioned, I'm a senior lawyer at the Environmental Investigation Agency, EIA. Nice to be here, and thank you for having. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the financial aspects of a global plastics treaty. In a sense, you can see as a bit of scene setting. I got 3 slides and I'll run through 3 topics. The first will be the existing financial landscape. The second will be financial resources, and the third will be financial mechanism. Next slide, please. So the existing financial landscape. So there is an existing financial landscape that exists. Many countries have been giving overseas development aid for a while for the purposes of reducing marine litter or for addressing plastic waste. There is financial support that is flowing from donor countries to recipient countries. But following some analysis by UN Environment and then engagement with countries, we've come to see that there are some problems with the way that the current financial landscape is currently constructed. So donor countries, what we find, have very little coordination in their bilateral funding strategies or with project funding at a national level. As mentioned before, this leads to redundancies and inefficiencies. Some topics, particular items maybe, such as single-use plastics, get significant attention. Certain countries get more attention than others, while other topics and countries seem to have been forgotten. So there's little coordination, which leads to a bit of a patchwork approach from donor countries. Also, we have limited donor attention to sectors with significant plastic footprints and impacts. So for example, we might get, as mentioned, a lot of single-use plastic attention, but then textiles and agri-plastics, which are significant contributors to marine plastic pollution and plastic pollution more broadly, tend to get ignored oftentimes. For example, we might see limited attention to gender issues, such as the disparate impacts on women from chemical additives. And we might see an overlooking of the importance of the informal waste pickers and that sector and indigenous communities. And so what we see is limited donor attention to certain areas, and that's from the donor side. On the recipient side, from recipient countries, it can be challenging to access the existing funding. This is what we repeatedly hear. There are multiple windows, which means there are multiple places where you have to go to get the funding. Different countries have their own sort of departments that are designed around that. And they come with different criteria. There's different timeframes for project submission, for reporting, and other funding requirements. That can be very challenging in terms of accessing the funding. I work for an NGO. I am very sympathetic to this argument that it can be difficult going to different windows. And so that's one problem that was identified. And then the other is difficulties in coordinating with national budgets and plans. As we're seeing, countries are dedicating ever increasing amounts of their own financial resources to the problem. And having funding come externally at different timeframes, at different points, with different requirements and restrictions, can make it difficult to balance the budgets and plan accordingly. So those are some of the problems in the existing financial landscape. But I just want to reinforce that, you know, the financial landscape as it exists does not lack financial resources per se, but it lacks the structure and coordination toward the achievement of clear objectives. Next slide, please. As far as the financial resources, what are we talking about? Here, I put this in the context of a convention, and there you can divide it into roughly two categories. On the one hand, we have financial support to the Secretariat. This is financial support that supports the day-to-day operations of the convention. Examples of approved 2020 budgets for various secretariats are Ozone, 5.3 million, Basel, 4.8 million, Minamata, 3 million, UNFCCC, 30 million. With the exception of the UNFCCC, it's not a significant amount of money, and typically those contributions are spread around all countries according to their capacity to pay based on GDP. The other financial support is the financial support to developing countries. This is to help them meet their commitments. We can broadly put the financial support to developing countries into two categories. One are the enabling activities, and there I've listed in some sub-bullets several different enabling activities. These are the actions that will enable the countries to be able to meet the commitments and fulfill their objectives. The next category would be incremental costs. These are the incremental costs of compliance. Sometimes there are additional costs unrelated to the enabling activities that developing countries have to take on. And often the difference is offset or is contributed to by a fund. Next slide, please. And then finally, I'll get to financial mechanisms. So there are a lot of different ways of delivering this financial support, and I've listed several here in the bullets. General trust fund, that is typically the mechanism that's used for the Secretariat. There are specialized trust funds that focus on specific issues. You have partnership-based program-specific trust funds and donor-based program-specific trust funds. I'm not going to get into the details of these, but if you are interested in understanding the typology of the financial mechanisms, I would encourage you to visit our website. We have a briefing on the financial aspects, which dives much further into detail into these different mechanisms. Finally, you have the bottom two, which are the multi-purpose multilateral fund and the dedicated multilateral fund. I want to talk briefly about these. Multi-purpose multilateral fund would be something along the lines of GEF, whereby you have various conventions that fall under it. It's one big fund that caters and funds and supports various conventions. And then on the other hand, you have a dedicated multilateral fund. This is a fund that stands alongside the convention, that is designed and tailored to meet the objectives of the convention, that is answerable to the governing body, and is quite narrowly tailored to what we're trying to achieve here. Such an example would be the multilateral fund of the Montreal Protocol. I have a bias towards the dedicated multilateral fund. I've seen it in action. I've seen it very successful. I think this is the type of fund that we should be advancing here within the context of the convention. And it is a fundamental aspect to whether this convention will ultimately be successful or not. And with that, I will close my presentation. Next slide, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tim. In addition of having given us a very good overview of the questions that need to be answered and the options and challenges of what we know about, you've sticked exactly to the second to your 7 minutes. So you have my full gratefulness as a facilitator. So thank you very much. Our next speaker will be Delphine Harry. Delphine Harry is the manager for marine pollution at ProBlue. She's a senior environmental engineer and also works as environmental natural resources and blue economy global practice. This is the department under which Delphine is the manager for marine pollution. So Delphine, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Okay, so good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'd like to thank you for the invitation. My name is Delphine Harry, and I'm the focal point for marine litter and plastic pollution in the World Bank. And I also manage activities related to that sector in a program that is called ProBlue. It's a program for multi-donor trust funds, as it was just mentioned in Tim's presentation. It was established in 2018, thanks to Norway, Canada, Germany, Denmark, and few others. And now we have 16 countries, donors who are in the program, with, for example, the United Kingdom recently joining, as they have announced at the COP26 a few months ago. So today, really the message I would like to convey is that the World Bank Group and ProBlue program in particular stand ready to continue support countries and private sector alike in their efforts to address marine litter and plastic pollution. So to keep in mind, ProBlue has recently committed, since it has been established, more than 35 million of activities in analytics and technical assistance to countries, and also at the regional level, for example, to the OECS in the Caribbean, to the ASEAN in East Asia, etc. And the World Bank as a whole has a portfolio in activities addressing plastic pollution and marine litter in excess of 5 billion. And we have more than 2.5 billion of projects in a wide range of sectors that are going to include activities for the prevention of plastic pollution and marine litter. And that includes tourism, fisheries, a number of entry points that we can look at. So the approach that we're following is a comprehensive one, as it has been already presented. It requires really a combination of solutions customized to the country needs that are closely linked to a circular economy, but with a big priority on stopping the leakages by improving solid waste management system on one hand, but also river basin management on the other hand, because a lot of the leakages are happening on land, obviously, and the rivers are the main pathways to the ocean. And as countries implement their stimulus and recovery plan, there is a big opportunity to build back in a more sustainable way, address the drivers of plastic pollution, and change the behaviors from both the consumers and producers, and shift from our current throwaway model. So that's really the approach that we are following, and ProBlue is providing financing to do this, analytics, to get the magnitude of the problem, and to help develop the action plans. I'm going to go into that in a minute. But this is also really the overall approach that both the World Bank and the IFC are following, which is the private sector arm of the World Bank, are following when they work with country clients or with private companies that wants to address plastic pollution as a whole. So, as I said, solid waste management is a priority, but the circular economy for plastic is really also the longer-term solution. And we see that when we look at the percentage of plastic that is being recycled globally, in a couple of numbers up in there, but about 9, 10, 11% are being recycled. And that's a lost value for the economy. So we have done, thanks to ProBlue support, we've done some studies in Thailand, Malaysia, and the Philippines, where the analytics have demonstrated that there is an untapped market for some of the resins, which represent $6 billion per year, that are in fact lost to the economy. And that represents about 75% of the material value that is lost to the economy and then goes to the environment, and depending on the level of collection and disposal for waste in those countries. And that means also private sector investments and job opportunity that are missed along the way. So for that, we need to ramp up the financing from both sides and create the incentive for the private sector to invest in circular economy. So the question is really how to create those incentives. And we really think that there is a very important link between governments as enablers and the private sector. So government can enact and implement the legal and regulatory framework that break down the barriers to investments using economic and financial instruments. And we've seen some of this working in Kenya, for example, or Rwanda, that started to do some of the bans more than a decade ago. And we've done also some financing and some analysis, in Vietnam, in Ghana, in Nigeria, where thanks to ProBlue, we're working in assessing plastic value chain and identifying the barriers for private sector investment in new materials, in sustainable packaging and recycling markets. So that's really something that we can do, and we will continue doing it. And as you can see on that slide, is some examples of the areas of interventions that we have in the World Bank that we will continue having. And some of those are supported by ProBlue. So just a quick question, a last word on ProBlue. How do we work in ProBlue? Well, we work on demand from countries. We join efforts sometimes with the IFC to provide the analytics and the technical assistance needed to understand the magnitude of the problem, identify the entry points, and provide then the roadmaps and action plans that countries will need to implement their programs. In the next slide, I'm presenting some examples. I don't have enough time to go into details, but really what I wanted also to convey that in addition to the World Bank usual instruments that we can provide to countries, ProBlue is already a mechanism that is existing, that is doing activities in countries and could continue doing so as the UN process unfolds, which is one of the topic, the main topic, not one of that we are discussing today. So that's really was my main message that I wanted to convey. And in that program, some of the analytics are focusing on the downstream part of the life cycle, solid waste management, with a gender angle. How can we help women get more opportunities and get more access to finance, for example, in that space, but also on the regulations as EPR mechanism, fiscal reforms, etc. So that activity are really crucial also to help countries in their efforts to address marine plastic and pollution. So that will be my last slide. I think that in terms of sustainability, the main message is that the Building Back Greener and Bluer gives new impetus to drive policy changes that we create a more sustainable future. It's an opportunity for jobs and improve livelihoods, as I've tried to give in few of the examples. And in the World Bank Group, we stand ready to continue providing this technical assistance and the financing, and ProBlue is one of the instruments and mechanisms available to continue helping during those efforts. Thank you for your attention.
This was quite interesting and enlightening, and I'm already, I think the presentation was a good indication, a good sign of the existing fragmentation of instruments that can support this. And in the follow-up to this, we'll see, I see there are some questions that are popping up in the chat, but I think it will be interesting to also reflect together later on the Q&A session on how or if and how ProBlue can expand from a ocean pollution frame to a broader approach that meets the approach that seems to be taken by UNEA. And it was very interesting to see that you're already integrating these kind of thinking in your instrument, but it might be interesting to follow through and and explore that in more detail. So thank you very much, and thank you also for sticking up to the time. I'm dealing with very organized speakers today, and makes my job very easy. So the next speaker, I'm sorry, will be Just Ditkris. He's the program officer of the BRS Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Convention Secretariat. Just very sorry for having skipped your speaking turn, but now the floor is yours.
So yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity and for the introduction. I hope I can share a few interesting insights that you may be able to draw from our experiences under the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm conventions when it comes to financing as well as technical assistance. So let me share a few what I believe are important aspects in that context, and then hopefully that can help us in deliberating also with regard to a potential future agreement. So I'm sure you're all aware of the BRS conventions, so I'm not going to go into much detail, but just to very briefly recap, we have the Basel Convention on the control of transboundary movements of hazardous wastes and their disposal, which entered into force in 1992 and currently counts 189 parties, so basically almost universal coverage. Then the Rotterdam Convention on the PIC procedure for certain hazardous chemicals and pesticides in international trade entered into force in 2004. With 165 parties, and last but not least, the Stockholm Convention on POPs, which entered into force in 2004 and has 185 parties. Now, each of these conventions operates through a general trust fund and a special trust fund for voluntary contributions. These funds are used for a variety of purposes, ranging from the organization of conferences of the parties, meetings of subsidiary bodies, things like the clearinghouse mechanism, of course, the staff, and importantly, also the provision of technical assistance and capacity development. For example, in the budget for the last biennium 2020-2021, technical assistance and capacity development actually accounted for approximately 12% of the total budget, most of this being located in the Special Trust Fund for voluntary contributions. It should, of course, be noted that that the trust funds are for activities of the secretariat, so to speak. However, for example, when it comes to technical assistance funding, this may then be rechanneled in some cases to governments as part of, for example, country-level projects that we implement as part of our technical assistance. Also, for example, under the Basel Convention, there's an implementation fund under which funding may be earmarked for the purpose of covering costs associated with the implementation of compliance action plans by specific governments if there are any issues with regard to compliance. Then we have the Global Environment Facility. However, the GEF is only the financial mechanism for the Stockholm Convention, not for the Basel and Rotterdam Conventions. In fact, the fifth review of the financial mechanism concluded that although the GEF has responded adequately to COP decisions, the resources for POPs in the GEF have not been commensurate with the evolution of the convention. That was the conclusion of that review. It should be noted, though, that although the GEF is not the financial mechanism for example, the Basel Convention, there are nonetheless GEF projects that, of course, contribute to the implementation of the Basel Convention directly or indirectly. We could take a number of examples, but one that comes to mind is the Islands project, for example, where they look, among others, at addressing plastic and also at waste management issues. So, of course, such cross-cutting thematic projects can also contribute to the implementation of the conventions. Then again, cross-cutting across the conventions, we have the special program to support institutional strengthening, which applies to or supports the implementation also of the BRS conventions, of course also Minamata and also SAICAM. And yeah, thanks to a large number of donors, has funded 57 projects in this area. Even more overarching, and that's what you see at the bottom then, is the sometimes almost forgotten integrated approach to financing the sound management of chemicals and waste, which still provides an overarching framework relevant for not just the BRS conventions, but also more generally. And of course, what it advocates is that we need to look at mainstreaming, industry involvement, as well as external financing as key pillars in financing chemicals and waste. So as I hinted upon, parties to the convention are supported through a variety of technical assistance and capacity development activities. So here on the screen, you can see a number of examples. And for this, we've received very generous contributions from governments of Canada, France, Germany, Japan, Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, Switzerland, the EU, the Norwegian Agency for Development Cooperation. And quite important to mention also, I think, in this context, because I just mentioned industry involvement. And there, I think it's interesting to see that also, for example, the Norwegian Retailers Environment Fund supported some of our projects, meaning that industry in that case is also involved in financing sound management of chemicals and waste, and in this case, plastic waste. Another crucial means of supporting parties in implementing the convention are partnerships. Again, there's a variety of partnerships under the conventions, but given our topic, I just wanted to briefly highlight the Plastic Waste Partnership, which now counts 233 representatives of 114 member entities, and I think plays a critical role in mobilizing multi-stakeholder action, bringing together businesses, government, academia, civil society, etc. And it also implements a large number of pilot projects. And this is just a brief overview of all the technical assistance projects and other projects that we're currently implementing, both under the Plastic Waste Partnership, as well as under the Small Grants Program. And next slide, please. On the next slide, I will just very briefly introduce that. Because actually another vehicle that we use are the regional centers under both the Basel and the Stockholm Convention. Here you can see where they are located because they provide very crucial technical assistance, technology transfer, and other support to parties all over the world through their regional networks, including in the context of the Small Grants Program. And then to conclude, just to highlight maybe two points that I really wanted to highlight with this presentation. The first is that I think a key takeaway is that there's various ways in which parties can be supported. It can be through technical assistance projects, it can be through partnerships, it can be through training and technology transfer, facilitated at the regional level, for example, et cetera, et cetera. So there's many tools and venues and channels that we can use. And secondly, I think the integrated approach to financing still remains valuable. As dedicated external financing, mainstreaming, and industry involvement are all still needed. Thank you very much, David.
Thank you very much, Jost. I think this was very interesting to learn from this particular chemicals and waste cluster, which is very, very strongly linked and related to the question of plastics for the many reasons that I suspect our attendants will be well aware of. I believe the next speaker, which is now Vito Buonsante, which is the policy and technical advisor for IPIN, the International POPs Elimination Network, will also be from the chemical and waste cluster. What can we learn and what can we expand and what can we even do better if something can be done better? Vito, the floor is yours.
Thank you, David, and thanks for the great speakers ahead before me, and thanks for inviting me to this. Like I want to bring IPIN's contribution to the discussion on the plastic treaty. So without further ado, like maybe many of you know IPIN. It's a network of organizations based in 124 countries and from pretty much all over the globe, and we work bringing some local concerns to the international work and the international conventions, and we have experienced like the difficulties in financing. So we do absolutely support the idea of a plastic treaty, especially a treaty that looks at all the impacts of plastic pollution throughout the life cycle. And in fact, as IPIN works traditionally on toxic impacts, that is also a problem that we see in the life cycle of plastics, where from production to the end of life, there are a number of toxic externalities, and these are those that necessarily would need to be addressed by a plastics treaty. Just going to the money, and we can see that at the same time as we know that the problem with plastic will increase because the global production of plastic will increase in time. At the same time, there will be an increase in the chemicals market, and it's becoming clearer and clearer that the plastic and chemical market, the chemical market, are intrinsically related. Like it's very hard to find polymers and plastics that don't have chemicals, and very often toxic chemicals included into them. So what is the problem? And the problem is that we have these externalities that need to be paid for by somebody, and when we have a plastic treaty, we need to think about a couple of things. One, as it was said by previous speakers, is like that we need to look at the entire life cycle. Having a treaty that looks at only waste management may lead to a treaty where there is mainly a public financing of the plastics public liability, which is the toxic impact, but also the challenges in waste management. So really, rather than discussing in this presentation or in this intervention what and how specifically we should provide technical assistance to various countries, I was challenged to by the subtitles around like how do we innovatively look at funding, and because like we have discussed like how typically conventions get funded, but we also know, and the experience from the Secretariat of the BRS have shown that there is very, very little funding that is absolutely insufficient to to fund like already the existing convention. So we need to think about a bit outside the box, and again, probably we can think also about old ideas, which is thinking about the Rio Declaration, which is about it's 30 years old this year. The Principle 16 talks about making the polluters pay, and so here I want to talk a bit about a proposal that came from IPIN a couple of years ago in cooperation with CL, and sorry for the conflict of interest of having the chair being the co-author of this report. But the innovative solution is really making polluters pay, from our point of view, also for plastics. Like this report was thought around the financing of the sound management of chemicals that is chronically underfunded, but the idea can easily apply also to the plastic supply chain, because fundamentally we're talking about a very similar market, a very similar actors, especially upstream. And we know that the chemical industry is very big, as much as it is like the plastic industry, and sales are going very much up. So the idea is like to have a coordinated international tax on basic chemicals sale. And when we talk about basic chemicals, we're mainly talking about the chemicals that form the building block of the production of toxic chemicals, or chemicals in general. But also these chemicals are often used for plastics, like some of these that are highlighted in this slide are like ethylene, propylene, are butadiene. They're known to be used also for plastics. And what would happen, like if we took only at 0.5% of these sales, even in fewer bigger producer countries, like we would be able to fund all these treaties and have enough money to create this. Like if we look at this pie, and obviously we would need to adapt these numbers to the present conditions, to the changing market, but a 0.5% tax would be extremely small. There are experience already existing of international coordinated taxes, and we can. I'm sure, like we can be innovative in thinking about how to do it. But the point is that rather than thinking about like old ways of financing these treaties that are where we're suffering, and where we can see like the plastic treaty also due to its visibility in the public opinion can take away resources from other treaties. What we want is really to find new money, new treaties, and echoing what was said before, like mainstreaming, like having more industry involvement in the financing of the externalities that this industry causes itself. So that was my contribution for now, and happy to speak about it more later. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vito, and thank you for also including, as you were saying, some innovative ways. I think it is extremely important to learn from what we've done before, but it's not as if what we've done until now works perfectly well, and I think it won't be too provocative to mention that. I think the existing instruments are doing their best and are definitely making a huge difference in the impacts of the environmental impacts of our societies on the world. But I do agree that it is quite interesting to also be able to think and consider innovative instruments to look into this. So continuing and pursuing our discussion of possible innovative instruments or other ways to fund these types of activities, our next speakers come from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. Karsten Weschholz is the Senior Policy Manager of Institution, Government and Cities at the Foundation. So Karsten, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for the invitation to this very interesting discussion, which is today about financial cooperation and technical assistance in a global plastics treaty. And I've been asked to share a few thoughts from our side about what we can learn from voluntary initiatives regarding the importance of consistent definitions and metrics. As you may know, the new Plastics Economy Global Commitment is an initiative launched in 2018 and is led by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation in collaboration with UNEP. And its approach looks at a comprehensive holistic transition towards a circular economy for plastics. There are now about 1,000 organizations from across the whole plastics value chain united behind one common vision, from plastic producers to leading brands and retailers, as well as waste management companies, but also governments and NGOs around the world. Under this initiative, companies representing about 20% of all plastic packaging produced globally have committed to ambitious targets to help realize that common vision. And this vision is substantiated by common definitions, harmonized metrics, and clear reporting guidelines. These help companies to look at eliminating unnecessary and problematic plastics, implementing reusable business models where possible, delivering on packaging solutions that are 100% reusable, recyclable, or compostable in practice and at scale. And finally, decoupling the use of finite resources by increasing, first of all, the amount of post-consumer recycled content, but also reducing the overall amount of plastics and virgin plastics packaging being used. Through the global commitment process, these companies commit each year to report their packaging data and the progress they made towards their targets in 2025. You can access these reports from individual signatories through our platform, but most importantly, you can compare them and provide aggregated and sectoral insights because of these common definitions and metrics. In 2020, we took these definitions, metrics, and insights from the joint reporting system to the financial sector. Concretely, we were approached by the UN Initiative for Responsible Investment, and there was a specific PRI, Plastic Investor Working Group, who initiated a project to develop guidance for investors engaging with companies in the plastics packaging value chain. So these included petrochemical companies, manufacturers of containers and packaging, fast-moving consumer goods, and waste management companies. We provided input for these guides based on the shared approach to address the root cause of plastic pollution that we have developed under the new Plastics Economy Global Commitment. I'm not saying that these are the only definitions and metrics that should inform financial cooperation technical assistance under future UN Plastics Treaty, but at least the work doesn't have to start from scratch. And ensuring consistency in what public and what private funding aims to achieve will be key. Another useful approach that we are currently involved in which we are currently contributing to is the work of the EU Sustainable Finance Platform. If you already have heard about the so-called EU taxonomy, this is a classification system establishing a list of environmentally sustainable economic activities. It could play an important role in helping the EU scale up sustainable investment and implement the goals of the European Green Deal. Again, the EU taxonomy pursues the objective to provide companies, investors, and policymakers with appropriate definitions for which economic activities can be considered as environmentally sustainable. And in this way, it should create or provide certainty for investors, protect finance from greenwashing, and help companies become more environmentally friendly, mitigate regulatory market fragmentation, and help shift investments where they are most needed. assuming that the future UN Plastics Treaty is supposed to contribute to different environmental, social, economic objectives and will not narrowly focus only on minimizing plastic leakage into the environment, at least in our view, the work on sustainable finance taxonomies in the EU and other countries around the world could be useful reference to establish a sound mechanism for financial cooperation and technical assistance. And you just, I mean, I don't go into all the details, but I think it's important that this work is really not only happening involving political discussions, it's really at the technical level, we are developing screening criteria that ensure that a taxonomy compliant activity makes a substantial contribution to at least one of these 6 objectives that you see on the slides. And I think most importantly, defines minimum safeguards that no significant harm is caused to any of the other objectives. And you see a couple of sectors that are currently being looked at by the platform, and a lot of them are obviously relevant for our discussion on plastics. To conclude, in our joint report that we developed with WWF and the Boston Consulting Group, we have spelled out the business case for a UN Plastics Treaty. And in that report from 2020, it became very clear that setting out global goals and binding targets, including mechanisms for financial cooperation, technical assistance, but also for national action plans, they all require common definitions and consistent measurements if we really want to harmonize policy efforts, enhance investing planning, stimulate innovation, and coordinate infrastructure development. While voluntary initiatives can deliver change among market leaders, an internationally binding approach is needed to deliver the necessary change at industry scale. And to emphasize this message to policymakers, more than 70 companies and financial institutions have launched a joint statement ahead of UNEA 5.2 to urge UN member states to establish an intergovernmental negotiating committee at UNEA 5.2 to develop an ambitious international legally binding instrument on plastic pollution. And I stop with sharing here, and I just will post in the chat the link to the statement, which builds on our experience with the new plastics economy global commitment, and hope that it will help aligning governments and stakeholders around what type of global plastics treaty is needed, but also inform how instruments and mechanisms for financial cooperation and technical assistance should be designed. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Karsten. I think this was quite enlightening and takes us in also quite an interesting direction in considering all the various possibilities in addressing this issue. I also want to thank you and congratulate you for the publication today. I think you were also part of it, of the new call coming from Fast Moving Good Company for a global legally binding treaty that covers the whole life cycle of plastic. We do believe that it will be extremely useful and interesting to get these industries' perspective into the building of the new framework, including the building of a financial and technical assistance mechanism for this future treaty and future framework. Our next and last speaker, certainly not least, comes to us from the UNEP Finance Initiative, which is a partnership of UNEP. And so Peggy Lefort is the Resource Efficiency Coordinator of UNEP Finance Initiative. Peggy, the floor is yours.
Thank you, David. And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. So thanks a lot for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here with you today to bring a different angle to our conversation today and to present you the work that we do on plastic or relevant to plastic at UNEP FI with the private financial sector. So maybe quickly a few words of presentation of UNEP Finance Initiative. So UNEP FI is a partnership between the UN Environment Programme and the global financial sector to mobilize private sector finance for sustainable development. We work with more than 450 banks, insurers, and investors to help create a financial sector that serves people and planet while delivering positive impacts. We co-develop with the financial sector principles to catalyze integration of sustainability into financial market practice. And for instance, we have developed the principle for responsible investment, PRI, the principle for sustainable insurance, PSI, and the principle for responsible banking, PRBs. We also co-create practical research tools and peer exchange forums to help financial institutions deliver on their sustainable journey. I also want to mention that we also encourage public and private sector collaboration. And two great examples of these are the developments of the TCFD and the TNFD, the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, which show how the private and public sectors can come together to create a strong drive of change. On this public-private sector collaboration, we also work on testing the usability of the EU Sustainable Taxonomy. So just a few examples of the collaboration with the public sector. Now maybe we can turn to a few initiatives that UNEP FI has developed in the last couple of years, which are relevant for the plastic pollution issue. So the first one on the insurance industry side, we published a report called Unwrapping the Risks of Plastic Pollution to the Insurance Industry, which shows how plastic pollution risks can affect the insurance industry in its role of risk underwriter, risk manager, and investor, and what are the multiple risks faced by the insurance industry, which take the form of physical risk, reputational risk, transition risk, liability risk. And the report highlights the role that the insurance industry can play on addressing those risks and provide recommendations. We also currently work on a study on environmental liability risk for insurers, and we are now keen to continuing to working on this with insurers. Another cross-cutting initiative that we have developed that is shown on the next slide is on sustainable blue finance. So UNEP FI's Sustainable Blue Economy Finance initiative hosts the Sustainable Blue Economy Finance Principles, which were developed by the European Commission, by WWF, the World Resources Institute, and the European Investment Bank. And on this basis, of these principles, UNEP FI has co-created together with financial institutions and experts a guidance, Turning the Tide, which analyzes and explores how to finance a sustainable ocean recovery. And after this first guidance, we are now working on the second one, a new one, which will provide guidance for the financial institutions on how to approach financial activities in some of the key ocean sectors, including solid waste, and so including plastics. And the guidance will provide practical criteria and recommendations on which activities from upstream to downstream financial institutions should seek out, should challenge, or should avoid. So with an upstream to downstream vision, which is important to us. The last initiative maybe that I want to mention today is the work that we have developed on target setting for banks. Which is, so we developed a guidance to building on the report Demystifying Finance for Circular Economies that was published last year. And this is a practical guide for a bank to define its baseline and set targets on the topic of resource efficiency and circular economy. It's not sector specific, but it can apply to plastics. And the very first step in this process is for a bank to identify what is the relevant framework to align with. And this is a real challenge. And we have seen with the banks that in our current fragmented policy landscape, identifying the relevant framework is the first challenge and not a small one. So we're not going to further develop work on this and collaborate also with our colleagues from PRI. Maybe just to wrap up a little bit what we have learned from all these initiatives and worked. A few common points emerge, which may be relevant for today's discussion. So first, a holistic approach is necessary, but this is a real challenge to the financial sector, as we need to, the financial sector needs to understand and assess new business models, circular business models, which often entail innovation, new risk assessment models, etc. So that's a challenge, and there's a need to raise awareness, to build capacity on this within the financial sector. Another point is that plastic pollution is a multi-stakeholders problem. And so there's a need to encourage coordination and collaboration between multi-stakeholders, and to encourage, for instance, blended finance mechanisms and innovation finance. And the financial sector has a key role to play through the investment decision they make, and also through the engagement that they can make with their clients and investees. But for that, they need to have a clear framework. And why that? Because in order to drive action, it is essential to set targets. We have seen that, and we are seeing that in the climate space. And we need to also make it happen on the plastic pollution space. So creating an enabling environment and a clear framework to set targets, which then allows to define how to take action. And so for this, a global and ambitious treaty on plastic is necessary to develop global goals, global targets, and common monitoring and reporting framework and metrics. And I think I'll stop there. I see it's time to conclude. So thanks a lot for your attention, and happy to further discuss with you today.
Well, thank you very much, Peggy, and thank you very much to all of our speakers. I thought this was very enlightening, and thank you very much, Peggy, also for bringing together at the end of your presentation and refocusing part of our conversation in the context of the global treaty and how the different initiatives and ideas that we've been discussing today can be implemented and can be put in place in the context of this particular future treaty. So we have a couple of questions that came to certain presenters. I will read them out loud now, just to give you a heads up. One question is for you, Walter, and the second question will be for you, Karsten. And then I may have a question of my own to basically spur maybe a little conversation and take us towards the conclusion. So the first question that comes from Ina Balik, the two questions actually come from Ina Balik. Thank you very much for your participation. To you, Walter, is a question on whether you could expand on what you meant when you mentioned matching mechanism. In your presentation, you did mention matching mechanism, and I wonder if you could maybe give us a little more details on this, or expand a little on this.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you also for the question. In some cases, and this is the case that I mentioned, for instance, in the UNFCCC architecture, there are mechanisms, bodies, or where you can do certain repository of opportunities, initiatives to provide support, either capacity building, learning opportunities, exchange of best practices, in this case for technology transfer and development, or capacity building. But the same could happen for financial support, different funds. And on the other hand, the idea will be to put together or bring together in that space the demands, the needs that could be either put forward into that space individually, or could also be developed through a more formal process, such as, for instance, in the case of the NAPs, in climate change national adaptation plans, where countries identify their needs on adaptation, and then they can match with what is offered through different initiatives, either multilateral, private sector, or intergovernmental as well. So that's the concept behind the proposals that have been mentioned during the preparatory process, and also in the conference itself by some, that perhaps an idea of such mechanism body could be put forward to respond to the technology needs and capacity the needs of developing countries and the offer that is out there. And we have seen today many examples of initiatives that perhaps could respond to those, in some cases even from the academia, that are not necessarily known largely as is the case in multilateral initiatives.
Thank you very much, Mr. Director. Karsten, that questions good. I see some very interesting question, but Karsten, I promised you a question. There is one that is quite straightforward. There was a question wondering if the Ellen MacArthur Foundation is also working with EFRAG, EFRAG, on the upcoming CSRD European Sustainability Reporting Standard. And I'm going to be in your hands because I'm not sure I could unpack those acronyms for you.
Yeah, probably we shouldn't use the acronyms. So there are two European processes. One, developing the taxonomy on economic activities that should enable the financial sector to support them. That's the one I was referring to. And at the same time, there is an effort to standardize the reporting in general for most of the medium and large-sized companies on sustainability, so on non-financial reporting. So we are by far not the only organization involved in this. Both processes have set up huge expert groups to try to inject thinking on how can we align and harmonize these reporting systems. And we have been nominated in both processes to contribute from a circular economy perspective. But to be fair, the taxonomy is the one which is at the part where we're looking into specific sectors and specific economic activities within those sectors, while the corporate reporting standards process is still at a sector agnostic level. So it will take a couple of years to bring it down to that level of granularity that we would need to learn what companies can do to contribute to a solution, circular economy solution for plastics.
Thank you very much, Karsten. And someone actually formulated in part the question that I wanted to put to all the panelists. So thank you very much, Steve Tolokin. There is a question asking the panelists to see if it was possible to discuss in a general way how much money could be needed for a successful treaty compared to how much is likely to be raised by different potential funding mechanisms. Of course, these discussions are at an early stage, but it would be interesting to get even some preliminary comments from the participants around this question of how much money could we assess would be needed to fully implement this, and how much does this sum rate against what we know of existing instruments and what we've been able to raise so far, even though we know that not two processes can be compared altogether. So I don't know if some of you want to volunteer to take this up, or whether I should be volunteering people, but I'd rather not do this, obviously. Yes, go ahead.
I can start. It's not. I don't think that there is an easy answer to that question, but thank you for asking it. It's indeed a very important one. I think that's the needs are in the billions. Obviously, there has been some roadmaps developed by a few countries with different partners that shown that for one country it could be in the 7 billion. For example, I think in Indonesia, there was a financing roadmap that was published by the World Economic Forum initiative, which is the Global Plastic Action Partnership, in collaboration with the Indonesia government. that was saying that the scale of the investment needs would be around 7 billion. I think that this financing is going to come from different sources, and the overview that we've had today from all of our panelists here, I think it's extremely interesting to see that it's going to take a lot of financing coming from different sources. You can look into blended financing from the public sources and the private sources that will be needed, I believe, to address this issue. And those combined financing are very important to reach some levels that will be helpful for the countries. I don't know if there is a global number, so I will give some space for my other colleagues. I see that others are willing to talk, but I think that what is interesting and important is really that it cannot be by one government alone, and it's not going to be one financing institutions like the World Bank alone. And I think that's something that we need to work on the financing institutions, to try to find ways to combine our sources of financing. Sorry for us to know.
Thank you very much, Delphine. I see that Jost and Karsten have their hands up. Jost, I'll give you the floor first because you're the first one I saw, and
Yeah, thanks a lot. I agree that this is. Sorry. I agree that this is a very difficult question because, I mean, first, we would need to know the exact scope of such an agreement, right? So it really depends how far governments are willing to go, should they come to a conclusion. You know, which parts of the life cycle will be covered? Will it be a comprehensive agreement? And many other variables that would need to be decided. Maybe there are also some discussions on certain sectors might be particularly covered, others maybe not so, etc., etc. So it really depends on also the degree of the obligations, right? Is it more of a framework type of convention? Is it so? There's so many questions that I think it's extremely difficult to answer that question at this stage. I think what we all agree is that with the global plastic waste crisis, plastic waste crisis, a significant amount of resources will be needed. I think that is clear. But then the more precise numbers, I think it's a bit difficult to do that at that stage. What I just wanted to still add to that is that what I think is important that and that related also to another question I saw in the chat, you know, about how flexible they should be, these mechanisms, is that they, from what I've seen with other instruments, that what is needed are good incentive mechanisms that are well functioning, so that really provide a clear also financial incentive for those receiving the funds to use them properly, and then to advance in the implementation of the convention. I mean, we have seen that in the past, that if there's a clear financial incentive and other incentives such as technology transfer, then normally this has resulted in an increase in the implementation rate. Thank you.
thank you very much, Jost. Karsten, you're next, and Walter, I saw your hand, so I'll be giving you the floor next.
Yeah, thanks. I think I agree with previous speakers. It's quite difficult. You need to break the financial needs or the need for financial support according to different value chains, geographies, and then also differentiating between the measures that are needed upstream and downstream in the plastics world. And I think by now we certainly have a better understanding what are the costs implicated for better waste management. So at the foundation, we looked last year into the costs for collecting, sorting, recycling of packaging globally. And even in the best case scenario, that would be in the magnitude of an estimated $30 billion globally. And then we took it as similar as other speakers have pointed out, saying there's not a single source of funding, neither public or private, which would cover these costs. So we need to design regulatory mechanism, and the treaty can help countries setting up these mechanisms, like extended producer responsibility schemes, which allow mobilizing funds from those industries putting products or packaging on the market that afterwards cause these costs for collecting, sorting, and recycling them.
Thank you very much, Karsten. Walter, I'll give you the floor, and then maybe I'll make I'll take the floor, and I'll use my facilitator authority to just add a little remark to what was said.
Thank you, David, and I think it's a good question. However, and also to agree with all the previous speakers, but sometimes I think it's more than the figure, the exact number is important to ensure certain conditions for those fundings, and that is the predictability, the adequacy, the efficiency in terms of delivery, the final delivery of those resources. In following up my previous comment about learning from experiences in other forums, we have seen the promises or pledges for the 100 billion annually from 2020 on climate finance unfulfilled. The current debate that took place in Glasgow, from figures going from 100 billions until 1.4 trillion, and again, for us, it's not so much the figure; it's really more the conditions, and that is, for instance, the predictability, and I think that also matches with what Peggy mentioned about the need to have the targets first. And then they will need to see the resources that are needed to achieve those targets. I just wanted to complement that element of answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And before giving you the floor, Vito, just want to build on this. I fully agree about the value of the treaty to set targets and to help us assess the needs. I think one point that was made also by an early speaker, Tim, I think it was you, was the need to consider both the capacity building, the onboarding needs to implement this, but also the incremental cost, because as the obligations evolve, as the treaty, as the convention lives, just as we see the Basel Convention, other conventions live, new instruments, new obligations, new approaches can also be adopted. And so that also reinforces the need, as was mentioned by one of the questions, for flexibility in the various instruments. And the other point that I think is important to take into considerations are the I'd say virtuous circle that starting to implement a number of obligations, a number of phasing out of the plastics can also bring, both in terms of financial incentive and on cost saving, because we've been talking a lot about the cost of actual obligation. The cost of inaction is always the other flip side of that discussion. And we're identifying those as costs. But it is also important to think of the costs that we're discussing now are investments, and rather than saving on the basis of the cost of inaction that would have to be covered in case no treaty or no actions was taken. Vito, I'll give you the floor. I see that Delphine, you also had your hand raised, so I'll give the two of you the floor, and then I will go around the speakers and give you 1 minute for final statement each in the order in which you took the floor. So Vito, you're on.
Thank you, David. I just wanted to say in relation to this discussion that obviously it's very difficult to make this assessment, but it's also difficult to go into a negotiation and decide what it's important for the treaty that we're looking at on the basis of the what are our estimated financial needs. I mean, this is a treaty that is going to be negotiated on the basis of an obvious urgency, and what we're calling here is to think about, like, to combine all the contributions that were brought to the table today to a bit diversify, like, how we are getting how we're financing international instruments. And so I just want to caution on negotiating on the basis of like the money that we have, but rather on the needs that we have, and probably we will need to create the financing later for that. So just that we don't discourage ourselves from negotiating an ambitious treaty. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Vito. I think this is a critical point. We don't want to limit our ambition about what's feasible, but if we want this treaty to be efficient, we have to identify what is needed and have some trust and work on then building the resources to address this. Delphine?
Thank you, David. I'll be extremely quick. I raised my hand before you mentioned the costs of inaction. So I'm going to skip my points, and for the sake of time, we have 1 minute to finish. I will use that time later. Sorry, thank you.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much, and sorry that I stole your point. So I will now invite all speakers in the order in which the floor was taken to maybe offer us some closing remark and recommendation or inspiration for the work to come. Walter, you're first.
Thank you, David, and thank you again for all the very, very important presentations from the expert panelists. I've taken note of all the links to the reports and publications that provided very important information. I think this will be very, very useful. But also, it's very important that all the participants at this event do take into account the need to continue fostering the political will that I mentioned in my introductory remarks. That is so much needed when we get closer to UNEA. We see that there are two draft resolutions on the table, as you already mentioned, and the comparison table also can provide some lights there. And in terms of everything that we have discussed today, that there's a clear need for financial cooperation and technical assistance, and yet the provisions that are there in some cases are still some sort of framework, not very detailed, and in some other of the other texts is absent. So I think that is also something that we really need to reflect, so that when we go to the negotiation table, we are prepared to provide all the inputs, all the experiences, all the opportunities that we have seen today into that negotiation table, so to enhance that framework, that response, if we want to really have and put together a comprehensive and efficient response to the global threat of plastic pollution. So just to encourage everyone to do that and really go into the details that are provided today. Thank you very much. And once again, thank you for the invitation.
Thank you very much, Walter. Tim?
Thank you for the opportunity to participate. I guess a few reflections on what we discussed. In thinking about the financial mechanism, I'd really encourage people to look for the answers to some questions about how can we best promote the objectives of the agreement? How can we ensure, as Walter has stated, that we have stable and predictable funding to recipient countries? How best are we able to align with the priorities and the aims of the governing body? How do we help ensure that there's ongoing and adequate expertise that's developed within the Secretariat of the fund, so that they can give out the money in the most effective manner and work with governments in its expenditure? And then how can we ensure that both donor and recipient countries have a say in how the monies are dispersed? And so those are questions that sort of drive me when I think about what we need. I feel that pushes us towards a dedicated multilateral fund. I think that is, if we were aiming high, that's the highest we could aim for. It's something that sits alongside of this convention that really is designed to bring about the objectives and the commitments within it. But with that being said, I'll also just make one note that was kind of raised in the end here. Waste management is not something that we can expect donor countries to fund indefinitely in recipient countries. And we're going to have to think creatively about how waste management itself gets funded by the polluters. And so everything I said before is related to the funds that I think we can all agree donor countries should be happy to contribute to. But when it comes to waste management, that's where the creativity really, that's where we need to get creative. And so with that, thank you for the opportunity to participate.
Thank you very much for outlining very clearly the question that we should be asking ourselves, and that will hopefully be guiding the discussion on this issue in the coming weeks and months. Delphine?
Thank you, David. I just want to also thank you, the fellow panelists, because I find their interventions extremely interesting, and also I think it reinforces the message that there is a need for collaboration between different initiatives, between different UN institutions, between the different international banks. And that, I think, is the first takeaway that I will bring back to our engagement in the World Bank, is way to continue these efforts in trying to help countries and the private sector in their efforts in a coordinated way. I think that's really one of the main messages, because there is still already a lot of financing, even though more is needed. And I think that was also very clearly made. But I think also that in order to make the solutions work, that financing needs to be also coming along the life cycle. And that's also some of the main points that a lot of us have been saying today. And I really think that's the reforms and the policy incentives that can be done upstream of the life cycle are going to be very important to balance also and to reduce at the source the loads and the volumes that are going to go into solid waste. And to build on the last point that Tim was making, if we only invest and if the financing goes only into the solid waste management part of the solutions, it's going to be unsustainable, because in 20 years, the problem will still be there, the infrastructure will be on top of that capacity, and that the investment will not be efficient. So I think that there is a need to anticipate and to go really beyond solid waste management and to keep a balance in the financing where everyone's coming from into all of the solutions, and create the market incentives upstream for the reuse, the remanufacturing, the repair, and designing products so they can be repaired and reused and remanufactured. And I think that all of these interventions are needed, and the financing should go in all of the different entry points that we've been discussing today. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Delphine, and thank you very much for our participants who are willing to stay just a little longer beyond the time. Jost, you're next.
Thanks a lot. I would like to come back to my point on the integrated approach. So first, dedicated external financing, of course, for any future agreement is absolutely key. I mean, it's the minimum. We can't really implement a convention without that, or rather, we can't expect developing countries to do so without dedicated external financing. But then also industry involvement is perhaps just as important. I mean, implementing a global treaty on plastic pollution without any industry involvement would be a Herculean task, to say the least, I think. And finally, and that's very often overlooked, but I think is really important, the mainstreaming aspect. So really and that's for both the donors and the recipient countries, right? So that both sides look at, okay, for example, what are the linkages between chemicals, plastics, etc., plastic waste with other topics, right? I mean, there's, for example, plastic and climate change. I mean, there are so many obvious linkages that can be drawn upon. And then how can we use that to actually mobilize funding that normally would not be mobilized for action on plastic? And this can go with biodiversity, it can go with many other topics. So I think this is absolutely key. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jost, for those inspiring words. Vito?
Thank you very much, and I agree with most of what previous speaker has said. I just want to go back to the point on making the polluters pay, because, like, unfortunately, this in the last 30 years hasn't happened that much, and we need to start to think about making that a reality. The issue of like financing externally waste management would be disastrous, but generally we need to make sure that that the polluters don't only benefit by the pollution they cause, but they also pay for it, and that we don't create a treaty that funds these polluters. And unfortunately, we need to do a lot of work, and there's a lot of lack of funding. So we need to go ahead on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vito. Karsten?
Yes, picking up on the notion that there's a lot of interest to move the focus of the treaty upstream and also covering a life cycle or circular economy approach, I think it reiterates the necessity that the treaty itself, but in particular the framework for any kind of financial cooperation technical assistance mechanism, must be based on a common framework. So there must be common definitions and harmonized standards where applicable to all elements of this story. There may be different priorities in different countries and different geographical regions in different sectors. But I think if we want to allow that different elements, the policy, the financial, the technical side of things, interact effectively with each other, we need to define first the framework, the baseline, the targets we want to work to. And this needs to happen at the global level so that we don't end up with fragmented solutions or a patchwork of solutions to plastics pollution. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very important reminder of the work ahead of us and the sequence in which we should be The final words.
Yes, I'll have the final words. Thank you. So yeah, no, I think I will be very much aligned with all what has already been said by other panelists. I think it's really important to set a common goal and a common direction, a common vision, which is based on a circular economy approach and with a clear goal to reduce the production of virgin plastics and to address the problem at its source. I think that's really a very important point. And important also to define a robust monitoring and reporting framework with harmonized definitions, metrics, standards, methodologies. A point that we have not really discussed today is the point of data collection. This is really key also as a basis to understand the baseline and to understand where to go and how to improve the situation. So data collection, that is also a very relevant point. And I would say, as we have already said, encouraging the development of enabling activities, technical assistance, bringing the science to the financial sector, technical assistance, support to innovation, all this is very important. Collaboration and coordination between stakeholders and between public and private finance sector, I think will be key. And my final word would be, as already mentioned by another panelist, is to make the link with the climate change. I think this is a really important point because it is really the top priority of everybody currently, of all stakeholders in the private finance sector and other stakeholders. And so finding a way to feed this topic of plastic pollution within the efforts that are currently deployed on the climate agenda is probably key to the success of a treaty. So thanks a lot for the invitation and your attention today.
So I want to thank you all very, very much for your participation. I want to thank the panelists for the very inspiring discussion. I want to deeply thank the Jen and Diana in particular for all the work that you haven't seen that it got into organizing this particular event. I want to thank the participant who stayed even a little longer for discussing on finance, which is usually not the one that is the most interesting and where you get the most attention in the contact group. So it's really a pleasure to see that much interest. And I also want to invite you all to keep looking and be interested. There are quite a large number of reports, articles, and others that will be coming out along the topic of the treaty in the coming weeks and in the weeks leading to the UNEP meeting in February and beyond that. Also look for other events from the Geneva Beat Plastic Pollution Dialogues. I suspect Diana will give us a few words about the next one. So thank you again to the participants, to the panelists, and to the Jen. And with this, I'll give you the floor back to Diana to say goodbye and to close the meeting. Oh, one thing I forgot. I saw that there were questions that were mentioned in the chat that we didn't have time to address. I invite the people who asked those questions to send those questions to the Jen that will then be redistributed to the panelists or to the speakers. I saw that there was one in particular on the IPCL initiative. Do send your question to Diana and the Secretariat, and we'll find a way to get in touch to answer those questions. So Diana, maybe goodbye word from you.
Thank you, David. And indeed, we have the questions and we relay them to the relevant colleagues. Thank you, David. Thank you for moderating this event. Thank you all for your inputs and for the quality that made this event really interesting. I just wanted to flag a few upcoming events. Indeed, on Monday, it's not part of this series, but it's a collaboration with the Geneva Cities Hub. We will have an event that will discuss plastics in cities and looking at good examples of how cities are handling this problem and what could be the role of cities in negotiations related to this particular topic. And another important event as part of this series coming up is the high-level dialogue on a global instrument on plastic pollution that will be held on the 1st of February, All the details of the event have not yet been published, but they will be shared with the people who have attended this series of events. And of course, we will also be active on a series of other events and other topics. One of them being on the preparation of the Conventional Biological Diversity meetings that are happening in Geneva in March. And we have an event scheduled on this Thursday. So if you are also looking at other topics, please join us for that particular topic. Indeed, you just mentioned the reports also, David, that will be issued in the run-up to UNEA. We have resources on our website in the preparations for UNEA, for the United Nations Environment Assembly, and we will share that there and on all the pages we have on plastics, whatever is relevant to that particular topic. Reports will be regularly shared in our newsletters or on the website, or of course on our social networks. And just maybe closing by, somebody has shared the link on the chat that we haven't shared with everybody. It was a report that was an article that was published in the Guardian today, referring to a study that says that chemical pollution has passed safe limit for humanity, according to some scientists. So the last events we have been holding were all about the importance of the chemicals, the pollution cluster, and the need to finance that cluster more seriously. So indeed, a lot to do, and we will. So a lot of discussion still ahead of us on this particular topic. So thank you for all of you who are still with us. Thank you for all the colleagues who have been working behind the screens that you don't see, but that make these events also useful and a success. Thank you very much to all.